This is Moshe Taragin from Acțion for the OU All Parsha series for Parshas Emor. Sefer Vayikra is a sefer of halacha, Taras Kohanim, the laws of Kedusha, the vicinity of Kedusha, where Kedusha is concentrated, the Kedusha Sashchina, but that Kedusha radiates outwards to the Machana and manifests not just in the laws of the Beis HaMikdash, but in day-to-day experiences. Kedoshim Tiyu, Ki Kadosh Ani Hashem Elokechem. We don't cocoon Kedusha or compartmentalize it only in particular cells, C-E-L-L, of Jewish experience, but Kedusha pervades all moments of Avodas Hashem. There are only two exceptions, two stories, two narratives in the entire book of Sefer Vayikra. One is when people try to get too close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Nadav and Avihu, Bakrivam Eish Zerah, Shalotzi Vosam, in the end of Shmini. And the other story is in the end of Emor, someone who tried to walk away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu and was so angry and hateful that he blasphemed. We call it, just to even avoid saying that concept, we call the Mevarach Hashem as a euphemism, because he didn't bless, he took a different approach. What caused him to walk away, to walk out the door, especially in the Midbar, where the Nisim were so palpable and vivid and so pervasive and so apparent and so obvious, and it seems like only one person walked away. And this is a very important question. It's a very sensitive question that I want to talk about. What causes people to walk away from religion, not in the year 2448, but in the year 2025 CE, of course, 5785. It's sensitive for many reasons. First of all, because people are complex, and there's never really one reason. Human beings are complex, and to feel that you can target or identify this reason or that reason is disrespectful to people, disrespectful to their own personal journeys, to homogenize human experience rather than to individualize it. It's touchy because it's hurtful, because the second you start talking about this formula or that formula, people who experience this in their lives and in their families and themselves feel incorrectly, and of course it's incorrectly judged, because it's hard to understand the unique circumstances of any person, family dynamic, experience in life, trauma in life. It's sensitive because very often people overlay different experiences from different cultures. A couple of years ago I was asked, maybe I think by the OU, I'm not sure, to participate in a panel or conversation, maybe a podcast, about off the derech in Israel and America. I said, you're combining apples and oranges. There's one experience in America and Chutz La'aretz, maybe you can't call it off the derech. I don't want to get into the terminology, but in Israel, it's a totally different experience. It's called differently, even though I don't like labels. Sometimes labels are reflective. Chazer b'sheila. I think many people who, let's say, people in Chutz La'aretz would look at in Israel as being off the derech. I think people in Eretz Yisrael would look at the people who are rendering those judgments about them from Chutz La'aretz saying, wait a second, who's on the derech and who's off the derech? And I'm just saying something provocative, but an important provocation. If I'm living in Israel, serving in the army, have a deep relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, finding my way through the landscape of halacha, am I off the derech or on the derech? So it's a very, very, and I know that I've attended shiurim and conversations and seen people writing things that I found offensive. I don't want to be guilty of the same insensitivity or simplifying complex equations and complex lives. So I want to talk about 3 or 4 phenomena that I've seen. Not that we're going to solve it, and not that anyone should feel that the reason that this one or that one is taking a certain life choice is because they fail to live up to these expectations. And it's just centering, identifying, articulating issues that can help us make some sense and maybe navigate it with greater dignity and maybe with greater success, however people want to define that success. So, I think you could point to 4 elements in the end of Parshas Emor. Some of them are elements which Chazal create, some of the elements, not create, but intuit. Some of the elements are already laid in the Psukim. I'm not going to go in order, literally, what's in the Pasuk, what Chazal introduce. So we're going to discuss 4 different points. Number 1, Chazal say, based on the Medrash, Vayetze ish Yisraeli, Vayidaber, Vayetze ben Isha Yisraelis, V'hu ben Ish Mitzri, Vayinasu b'machaneh, Vayikov ben Isha Yisraelis. What does it mean, Vayetze? What did he leave from? So we'll get to the literal reading, but Chazal interpret, Yatsa mi Parsha Hakduma. that he was reading the previous parsha, the preceding parsha in Emor, and it talks about the lechem upon him, and something about the lechem upon him irked him and pestered him and unnerved him, and that caused his departure. What was it about the lechem upon him? He thought that it was paradoxical, it was illogical. This is something meant to glorify Kadosh Baruch Hu in the Beis HaMikdash, and yet, instead of refreshing the bread every day, the breads were old and the breads were placed on the shulchan once a week. And they, of course, miraculously, they stayed fresh, but he felt this was disrespectful. Now, without answering his claim, and there are answers to his claim why the lechem upon him were only refreshed on the shulchan once a week on Shabbos, what bothered him was the inability to see the meaning behind mitzvahs. Now, there was meaning behind mitzvahs, and he should have asked someone. He could have maybe asked me, because I have some nice ideas about why the lechem was only refreshed once a week, and what that says about religion, and what it says about avodas Hashem. But be that as it may, he couldn't make sense of religion. It just seemed all arbitrary, antithetical, illogical. And when people feel that their religion has become mechanic, illogical, meaningless, dry internally, it's hard to sustain avodas Hashem where you don't feel that it's meaningful, that it provides you with inner authenticity and inner truth. And it's a cautionary tale, because I think over the last 30, 40 years, our community has become more intensely committed to halachic fidelity and halachic performance. But I also wonder, and it's not true across every community, it's not true across every family in every community, but as a general trend, have we become very performative and mechanical in our adherence to halacha, and how much attention do we pay to explain the meaning we find behind mitzvahs and the meaning we find in the life of avodas Hashem, and how that ennobles our life and how that enhances our life. I saw some stir on the internet a few weeks ago around Pesach. Someone came out with a syringe that had little levels that could measure what a kazayis is, and different ways to measure kazayis of wine and matzah and maror. And there were some who were very opposed to this. I wasn't so opposed to it, but I did sense the underwriting danger of over-quantifying halachic performance and perhaps investing too much effort or so much effort in the quantification and the sheer measurement, maybe at the cost of understanding what matzah is, what maror is. Assuming you have only limited time, maybe ideally you should spend time on both to keep the halachas as carefully as you can, but also to explain the meaning and the deep internal echo of a mitzvah and why it has meaning for you. So I wonder how long this will sustain itself. Obviously, every generation is different, but how can you pass a longer tradition to the next generation if you excel at demonstrating the manner and the technique of performing the mitzvah, but you don't always excel at either demonstrating, conveying, or just personally modeling how deeply evocative and resonant the meaning of each mitzvah is? Or, if not the meaning of each mitzvah, the meaning of a life of avodas Hashem, if it's not articulated properly. And that's one reason why I think people wonder, does this make sense? Is it all just arbitrary? Is it all just empty? Is it all just voodoo? Rather than realizing, Ki heim chayenu, this makes sense. This is a good way to lead your life. This is a way to want to lead my life, even if there weren't schar v'onesh, because I see the inner nobility, the inner integrity, the inner richness of a life of avodas Hashem. And that's one reason that people, I think, struggle with religious observance, latent in Parshas Emor. The second reason that I think people sometimes struggle, latent in Parshas Emor, is based on the literal reading, at least more of a literal reading, as explained and elaborated by Rashi. His father was Egyptian, and his mother was Yisraelis. Again, we don't really know Vayetze ben Isha Yisraelis v'hu ben Ish Mitzri. We don't know his mother's name. But Rashi fills in the blanks that he wanted to pitch his tent in the Shevet of Dan, which is the Shevet of his mother. But inclusion in communities was paternal, not maternal. Patrilineal lineage. Since his father was not a Jew, he wasn't granted permission in the Shevet of Dan, and he was an outsider. He wasn't included in anyone's camp. Now, where did outsiders camp? There were Erorav, there were people, I don't know, but there was a big brouhaha, and someone demanded that he leave. And his exclusion became a talk of the town, became a big event, and he felt excluded rather than finding some space for him on the margins of the boundaries. I don't know how it worked, what they should have done. And when you feel part of a community and you feel embraced by a community, despite your divergence and your personal deviances and your personal method of serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu or finding yourself, but you still feel that you're part of a community, it's easier to feel belonging, because so much of Jewish identity is belonging, not just how you perform and not just faith and not just halacha commitment, but to what do you belong? That creates our identity. What larger frameworks do we belong to? And when we feel that we belong, so first of all, even when we're still struggling to find our halachic equilibrium, we know that we still belong, and then at some point we have a place to return to, but not just long term, but it helps us even during the struggle. It's, well, on a personal level, this may not make sense to me, but I belong to a community, I'm loyal to a community, this makes sense to the people I hold near and dear, that I feel close with. I think that's one of the major differences between Israel and Chutz La'aretz, because in Israel there is one large national community called the Jewish nation, and therefore people who are not strongly committed to halacha still feel that they belong through many other ways and devices, army and community and nationhood and patriotism, national service, and not just national service in the technical sense. That's what makes it so much more challenging in Eretz Yisrael, because it's not binary. In Chutz La'aretz, religious education is binary. If you want to be Jewish, you have to be religious. And if you're not religious, it's hard to feel Jewish, especially if you grew up Orthodox. And in Eretz Yisrael, it's easier to feel very strongly Jewish, even if you're not fully committed to the classic halachic observance. But it still means that, again, as I said before, they may look at some of the Jews living in Teaneck or Melbourne or Golders Green saying, who's really on the derech? If I'm here serving in Gaza, protecting our people, deep relationship with the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, put on tefillin, say Shema, keep Shabbos in some level, who's more on the derech? Not that on the derech is an Olympics where we hand out medals. But that's why I think it's so important, and there's no way for me to say this without bordering on being insensitive, so I want to cut that off at the pass. That's why when families stay together and still embrace those who explore and create their own models, it's a healthier situation, certainly for the person who is exploring. Right? Some may say, well, it may be unhealthy for the other people who have improper role models, the other people in the family. I think that in certain Haredi, insular, maybe, again, I'm characterizing, but I think this is true, certain Hasidic environments, someone who's no longer able to uphold the strict Orthodox standards is asked to no longer be part of the family, because that will filter down, ripple down to the other 12, 13 children, so it's 12 versus 1. I think in our community we have more of a sense of trying to maintain familial bonds and trying to maintain familial commitment, because a family is a community also. So if you feel you belong to something, not just down the line when you feel that you may have reached religious homeostasis, but even during the process, even while you're working your way through, it may not be that logical or meaningful to me, but it is to the family or to the community that I belong to. So the second aspect that complicates life for the Mivarech Hashem is not only that he can't find meaning in mitzvahs, but that he can't feel included. He feels excluded. And again, as I alluded to before, it's not just the decision, but the body language and the language of exclusion. And sometimes policy and language don't go hand in hand. Sometimes as a policy, we can't create the levels of inclusion we'd like, because it's a complex formula, because we have to uphold certain standards, and including too far and stretching too far may dilute those standards. And if you try to include everyone, you include no one. But the language always has to be sensitive and humane. Mashal lama davar doma, and I refuse to talk about the ideology of Haredi conscription in Eretz Yisrael. It's not what I talk about on this platform or other platforms, but there are issues that I think are universal, and that I feel I should be mouthing for everyone to hear, whether you're listening to this year in Teaneck or in Lakewood or in Golders Green or in in Switzerland or wherever you may be listening to this. It's something I feel should be universally accepted. There's a difference between the decision that the Haredi world has taken not to serve in the army, which I'm not going to get into that issue right now, and the language and the rhetoric that has been adopted that's been very, in some cases, not every case, trivializing, demeaning to soldiers families, trumpeting and championing Yeshiva Bachim as being superior to soldiers in ways that are just hurtful to people who have sacrificed, whose lives have been upended, who are trying to serve our people while not falling into hatred and natural sinna, because people are really suffering based on this decision. And it's a decision that the Haredi world has unilaterally imposed upon others. It's one thing if there's a community that makes a decision who should learn and who should fight. But here, a group of people have made a decision. Without questioning the decision, you could feel like you're right, but the language has to be humble and respectful and not hurtful. You should never use hurtful language, but certainly in this context. So we always have to be careful, not just about the policies we take about inclusion or exclusion, but the language we use. And in this case, Rashi talks about a member of Shevet Dam who came to court and was very violent and very insensitive to the person who was suffering. The third aspect of the Mevarech that causes him to walk away, and this is something I didn't see in Chazal directly, but I'm just intuiting it, is Chazal say that his father was not just an Ish Mitzri, but was the Ish Mitzri that Moshe killed. He was the Ish Mitzri that Moshe legitimately killed because he was abusing a Jewish male, and I'll talk about some other issues later. And this young man suffered a trauma. This person suffered a trauma. He saw his father died and buried in front of his own eyes, not part of the Makos in which it was mass carnage and people just felt like the entire population. This was a person who saw his father singled out and killed. And even though morally and theologically we justify Moshe's act, he still suffers a trauma. And does he ever get over that trauma? And how is it living with people who have experienced Nisim when he doesn't experience a Nes? In his mind, maybe he deserves it. And what was his father's guilt? Maybe he didn't even know. Maybe he was too young. And very often, people's decision and their struggle with religion is a manifestation of an emotional struggle. And I don't say that in a patronizing manner, and therefore it's not real. It's real. And to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you have to be happy. And the foundation of religious identity is internal emotional welfare and well-being. And when people legitimately struggle with finding that balance and that emotional inner peace, it's very hard for them to summon the energy and to build the shoulders broad enough to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm not justifying any lack of avodas Hashem, but you have to understand what people are going through rather than being mean-spirited towards them and castigating them. Understanding that the people live through traumas in life, and sometimes their traumas cause them to struggle with many aspects of their life, and sometimes it's not even as psychologically direct as what I'm saying. People have a hard time feeling emotionally well off and emotionally balanced and psychologically firm, so therefore it's hard to carry the duties of religion. Sometimes it's projection. They take out their frustration. People take out their frustration. Everyone take out their frustration on other people. Sometimes people take out their frustration on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And without the harsh judgmentalism, and I don't say this in a dismissive or demeaning fashion, we have to be very careful about working on emotional well-being and emotional health prior to religious goals and aspiration. It's something that I learned from my Rebbe Rav Amital, that to always prioritize emotional well-being, even at the cost of accomplishment, because accomplishment will come. Without emotional well-being, the accomplishments will all crumble. And I think this is the third lesson in Mevarachas Hashem. I'm trying to give broad strokes without spotlighting this, that, or the other, or this type of goal, that source, or this reason, but just to help understand the process a little bit more with softer thoughts and softer hearts. The final aspect of this Mikal or Mevarachas Hashem, is that his father was an Egyptian, his mother was Israelis. Chazal fill in the blanks. His mother may have been the same woman that this Ish Mitzri had abducted and abused in Mitzrayim, and he was killed by Moshe, so he may have been raised by a single mother, but it's hard to know. But let's just read the simple pshat. His father was an Ish Mitzri, his mother was an Isha Yisraelis, and the story the Torah tells, historically maybe his father had died before Yetzias Mitzrayim, but the story the Parsha tells is of a mixed marriage, maybe of an Erev Rav Egyptian. And anytime there's a mixed marriage, I don't just mean mixed marriage in this case, but mixed marriage of different ideas and different perspectives on religion, the messaging that comes from parents can be very confusing. And messages have to be consistent. And consistent messages is not just how we make Tir on Shabbos, which Hashgacha we keep, and whether we believe in Medina Yisrael or not, although that can also be very confusing for kids. But the kids feel like there's love in the family, and that religion creates love. And if people associate religion with fighting and anger and hostility and, God forbid, violence and instability, it's very hard for them to feel what should be stabilizing and comforting and sturdying and steadying. And so when I talk about a mixed marriage here, I don't mean mixed marriage Jew and non-Jew alone. That's what it may have been. I don't just mean a mixed marriage Jew and Jew, but at different philosophical approaches or different levels of religious observance. I just mean, does religion reflect itself in a marriage of love and of cooperation and of respect and of commitment and of selflessness? Or is it associated with tension, anger, strife, discord, and fighting and disagreement? And therefore feels mixed rather than holistic. So, a lot to think about. I hope I was able to convey it in ways that are respectful of the complexity of the situation. Understand that people legitimately struggling. Don't count your own chickens before they hatch, both in yourself and in your children. Daven, HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'siyata d'shmaya. Don't al tamid b'atzmecha yamisas. Chazal say, whatever levels you've reached, be grateful for them. But Chazal say, don't trust them, because they can wither the same way they withered for B'Yochanan Kohen Gadol, who became a tzduki at the ripe old age of 80. So continue to work without being judgmental and overconfident. And these are the 4 lessons of the Mekadesh Hashem. Number 1, find meaning in mitzvahs and convey that meaning, not just technique, but also deep-seated resonance. Number 2, create communities of inclusion as best you can, because people will bind themselves to communities to which they feel they belong, even while their halachic experience somewhat is unsteady. Number 3, understand that people live through traumas, and sometimes those traumas, maybe those they share with you, those they didn't share with you, make it difficult for them to commit at the moment you'd like them to commit. And number 3, mixed messages will always be corrosive to religion and to the ability to impart religion. I'll end with a story. My Rav Amital would always quote this, my Rebbe Rav Amital. The first Kol Nidrei Ball was in 1888, I think in England, in London. Kol Nidrei Ball was a party that was conducted Yom Kippur night by those who wanted to announce that they had walked away from religion and that Yom Kippur was no longer meaningful. So what best way to empty and hollow Yom Kippur of meaning than to conduct an all-night ball, dancing and food and non-kosher food? So it was a Kol Nidrei Ball. You can Google this. And multiple Kol Nidrei Balls that started in England made its way across the ocean. And at some point, there was a group of even more radical anarchists who were disappointed and were angry at the Kol Nidrei Ball. They protested against the Kol Nidrei Ball because by having a Kol Nidrei Ball, you still indicated that Yom Kippur was a special night. If Yom Kippur was a meaningless night, just like any other night in October or September, it shouldn't be a special night identified or targeted for partying. It should just be a regular night of coming home and eating and sleeping. And what was their point? Their point was sometimes, even when you rebel against HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're still locked in a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's the arch-anarchists were smart enough to understand this and to protest against it. If we really want to break with Hashem, it has to be indifference and apathy, not rebellion. Sometimes rebellion is also a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And you're finding your way, and you care enough to talk to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and question HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we should all be zocha to be mekayim all the mitzvahs in the Torah at every moment in our lives. I'm sure everyone who renders judgment and everyone else is already at that stage. That's why they feel confident and comfortable judging other people. We should all be zocha to see that even Reikanim Shabo, and it's hard to even say Reikanim, even people that we think are Reikanim, are not really Reikanim. They're Malay mitzvahs karimon. They're full of mitzvahs like a rimon. Kifala charimon, rakasech, one thing I can promise you, if you listen to that last sentence, I promise you Mashiach Tzidkenu will come a lot quicker. More quickly than if we were under puritanical judgments about people who are legitimately finding HaKadosh Baruch Hu.